Baik, bertemu kembali dalam Niaga Awani. Kita masih lagi bersiaran secara langsung dari Renaissance Hotel Kuala Lumpur bersempena dengan ISWC 2024. Selesai saja tadi kita menyaksikan ucapan oleh Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim dan juga pengerusi KWSP sendiri. Dan kalau kita telitikan, Najib, apa yang dinyatakan oleh Perdana Menteri, banyak perkara-perkara yang melihat kepada bagaimana usaha untuk memastikan kehidupan yang lebih sejahtera kepada individu yang warga emas dan juga aging yang kita akan menempuh ataupun menjadi age nation.
Dan satu lagi term, super age.
Super age, ya. Super age dan juga super age nation itu, ataupun sebuah negara tua dan juga yang terlalu tua sebenarnya. Dan ini antara perkara-perkara yang dinyatakan oleh Perdana Menteri, penglibatan pelbagai kementerian. Sebagai contoh, KESUMA, Kementerian Sumber Manusia, berusaha untuk memastikan gaji yang progresif itu dapat dilaksanakan, kehidupan yang lebih baik, pendapatan yang lebih baik, kerana itu juga akan menjamin dari segi jumlah simpanan persaraan yang akan digunakan. Dan usaha itu juga sedang dipergiat oleh pelbagai kementerian dalam memastikan bahawa usaha holistik dapat dilakukan, memastikan kehidupan yang lebih sejahtera kepada warga emas di negara kita, Najib.
Saya suka apa yang disentuhkan oleh Perdana Menteri adalah bagaimana untuk kita melihat penyelesaian yang lebih moden dan terkini dan juga inovasi, inovatif. Penyelesaian itu perlu diwujudkan. Seperti apa yang kita lihat KWSP laksanakan seperti akaun fleksibel dan sebagainya. Ada negara yang sudah laksanakan, tapi yalah, ini acuan kita sendiri melihat kepada latar sosial masyarakat dan sebagainya, kita cuba laksanakan. Dan meskipun ada pelbagai pandangan, tapi pada akhirnya kita menilai gambaran yang lebih luas dalam konteks persaraan dan juga membantu rakyat secara keseluruhannya. Itu paling penting sekali. Dan pada akhirnya kita melihat juga apa lagi langkah lain yang boleh kita laksanakan untuk memastikan bahawa rakyat kita bersedia dengan persaraan mereka. Seperti kita bincangkan pada awal tadi, iaitu pendapatan untuk persaraan ini hanya tidak boleh hanya datang dari satu sumber, iaitu KWSP saja kita bergantung. Selepas kita bersara, kita perlu 2-3 pendapatan dan sebagainya. Apa yang boleh dilaksanakan itu kalau kita sihat.
Ya, betul.
Kalau kita pada usia persaraan mungkin berdepan dengan sedikit cabaran kesihatan dan sebagainya, itu antara cabaran lain juga yang perlu diperhatikan. Dan inilah yang menjadi topik yang cukup penting, yang ada kalanya sukar untuk dibincangkan. Kerana sensitiviti, kerana ada kalanya orang akan cabaran dan masalah orang individu berbeza-beza dari segi pendapatan terkini mereka dan sebagainya. Apa lagi boleh kita laksanakan secara holistik melibatkan pelbagai kementerian khususnya supaya kita pada akhirnya mencapai matlamat yang sama, iaitu persaraan kita terjamin untuk kebanyakan rakyat Malaysia.
Dan Najib, antara yang disebut oleh Perdana Menteri juga adalah, tadi kita sebut berkenaan dengan kementerian, ini adalah GLIC, Government Link Investment Companies. Kalau kita telitikan syarikat-syarikat berkait dengan pelaburan kerajaan ini, kalau boleh saya quote sedikit apa yang dinyatakan oleh Perdana Menteri, Malaysian GLICs including the EPF, Khazanah, KWAP has taken the lead in investing in venture targeted at developing the silver economy in Malaysia. So jelas menunjukkan bahawa sektor ataupun berkenaan dengan silver economy ini perlu diberi tumpuan dan juga fokus pembangunannya, kerana janganlah sampai kita dah jadi negara tua baru nak mulakan pelaburan dan juga fokus kepada pembangunan ini, ataupun pada ketika ini ataupun pada saat inilah syarikat-syarikat berkaitan kerajaan ini perlu memulakan pelaburan dari segi pembangunan silver economy. Najib,
itu yang kita nak bincangkan pada jam ini, sebab kalau kita bercakap tadi macam mana untuk kita menuju kepada semua orang akan tua kalau ada usianya, tetapi dalam keadaan kita sihat. Di tangan saya ini ada sebuah buku, tajuk dia Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. Interesting buku ni. Andrew Steele, Dr. Andrew Steele bersama dengan kita pada waktu ini untuk kita bincangkan bukan saja soal buku ini, tapi juga apa yang kita boleh pelajari dari konteks ini. Sebab tadi kita katakan bahawa untuk mencapai usia tua dalam keadaan sihat, supaya kita boleh menjamin bahawa wang yang kita ada untuk persaraan tersebut cukup untuk kita hidup dengan sihat. Sebab kalau kita
dan lebih bermakna lah
kehidupan kita tu kan. Kita bersama dengan Dr. Andrew pada ketika ini. Dr. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us this time. First of all, this is a very interesting topic because we would love to know how do we do this. Based on the study and also the book that I have right now, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old, how can we improve humans' aging process and lifespan so that the number of years we can live, in good health condition increases as well?
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Kuala Lumpur. And I think the most important message of my book is that we now have the scientific tools to slow down, maybe even in some cases reverse the aging process. And what does that mean? Well, the way that I think about aging, I'm an aging biologist. I look at this through a sort of biomedical scientific lens. And I look at human beings, and the aging process, obviously, it has a variety of different manifestations. You know, you might think about wrinkles, you might think about grey hair, you might think about wisdom, you might think about grandkids or retirement. But the way I see it is more a statistical definition of aging. And that's because human beings have a risk of death that doubles about every 8 years. And what that means is I'm 38 at the moment. My risk of death this year is about 1 in 1,000. And I quite like those odds, because what that means is if that were to continue for the rest of my life, I'd live into my 1,030s on average. But unfortunately, if you carry on doubling and doubling and doubling that, if I'm lucky enough to live into my 90s, but unlucky enough that medical technology doesn't change in the intervening time, I'll have a risk of death of about 1 in 6 per year. That's life and death at the roll of a dice. And so you can look at this in two ways, right? You can look at this as a human and think I've got this terrifying exponential wall of mortality coming at me, or you can look at it as a scientist and think, wow, what is this universal ticking clock inside all of our bodies that's causing our risk of cancer, our risk of heart disease, our risk of dementia, all of these diseases that are essentially caused by the process of aging. They all increase exponentially with time too. And so the idea is, if we can understand the processes that are happening inside our bodies, we can then develop medicines to intervene in these aging processes and stop people from getting ill in the first place. And that means we can keep people healthier for longer. And I think that is the single most important mission of modern medicine. And so that's what I'm trying to communicate to people today.
Dr. Andrew, by improving the way we age and also how can this improve lives and also save dollars and transform the human condition and eventually help to enhance productivity and also the economy?
It's a great question. I feel like every single one of those and more are things that will be changed. If we could slow down aging, you know, the impacts would be dramatic. I think the most important thing to think about, people often have a lot of ethical questions when I talk about this, but the single biggest, most important ethical, social, moral consequence is going to be that people are healthier for longer. Because, you know, what is the single most important thing in your life? It's your health. Because your health, obviously, it means that, you know, you're happy, you can get out and socialize, you can be independent. If you're not frail, you know, you've got muscle mass, you can play with your grandkids, you can, you know, maybe even be playing football with your great-great-grandkids. Who knows what will be possible in the future? But maintaining that health, that independence is what I think is the most important thing throughout our lives. And then that then has ramifications throughout the whole of society. To take the example of the economic benefits, aging is just very expensive. You know, if people get these diseases of aging, cancer, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, a lot of healthcare costs an awful lot of money. If you think about something like dementia, we actually haven't got a great deal of good treatments at the moment. And so that means we have to care for people for years and years, which is a very expensive thing. And then what might happen is that maybe your friends or your relatives have to give up work or go part-time to look after older people. This is a, you know, hugely important thing that people in society are taking, it's happening in people's everyday lives all of the time. And if we could alleviate some of that benefit by keeping people healthier for longer, then that's going to have a huge economic benefit. And in fact, one analysis showed that if we were to develop a drug that could slow down aging by just 1 year, that would then delay, you know, all of these different diseases by 1 year. It would be worth 38 trillion, so that's 38 with 12 zeros, dollars to the US economy, which is a phenomenal sum of money. It's about twice US GDP for anyone counting. And you know, these aren't numbers that you see in any other economic context. There's this huge amount of money, you know, sitting on the table for us to get if we can just develop the interventions that can help us slow down and, you know, ameliorate the aging process and keep people healthier for longer.
You know, when I was in London for work, then I went to the Hyde Park with my friends, all right? So I saw the people, you know, ride bicycles and then jogging and all that. And we were you know, having a conversation about all this lifestyle. So we were talking about, you know, if we have this kind of weather, much easier for us to do all this. So meaning, in the context of Malaysia, we have different circumstances from other countries. Different countries have different circumstances in terms of, you know, creating a good ecosystem for their society and community. But what kind of policies do you think that the government should? I know this is quite broad and it really depends on the circumstances, but what kind of best practices and also policies that we can do to support you know, community to age well in that sense?
So I think there's a whole load of different things the government can do. It's a really important area for governments to get stuck into. And I think the first and the most obvious thing is exactly what you were talking about. It's the sort of lifestyle stuff. Because today we do not have a single drug, we don't have a single supplement that can slow down aging in people. We've got loads of ideas in the lab. I'm very excited about this science. I don't want to downplay it. But there's nothing that you can take that I can recommend. I don't take anything. I'm just, I'm just dieting and exercising and trying to do all the right things in that respect. And there are loads of ways that governments can try to make this easier. So for example, I think active commuting is really important. So the idea that, maybe you can cycle to work or cycle to school or cycle to get your groceries or walk or run or whatever it might be. Obviously that's harder in a country with weather like this, but just making that a little bit easier for people. Because when I used to cycle to work, that meant that I was guaranteed to get that half hour of exercise at each end of my workday. And that's an amazing thing, because I'd have had to either spend that time sat on the train or spend that time pedaling my bike. And I think if people can integrate these things into their everyday lives, London certainly isn't the best city in the world to cycle, and a lot of people think it's pretty scary on the roads of London. If you look at a city like Amsterdam or a city like Berlin, where I live now, there's a lot more bikes on the streets, and that's just because there's more cycle paths.
Yeah.
All of this kind of stuff is very much within the domain of government. Then if we think about things like nutrition, there's a lot of stuff governments can do with taxes and regulations and just little nudges to try and get people to make healthier choices, because we know that's a really difficult thing. Yeah. But the message that I'm really trying to convey is the single best and most important thing that governments can do is invest into the research into this aging biology to understand the aging process. And the reason is, wherever you are in the world, there are all these complexities. You literally just mentioned this idea that in Malaysia the weather's not quite so conducive to cycling to work as perhaps it is in London. And what that means is that this ability to slow down the aging process through lifestyle will hit in all kinds of different roadblocks. People have very busy lives. They've got lots of different, they've got childcare, they've got seeing their friends and relatives, they've got, cultural stuff, they've got keeping up at work. There's just not a lot of time to fit, eating well and getting the optimal amount of exercise into your week. Yes. And so I think something that can really help with this public health stuff is if we had a real anti-aging medicine in our back pocket. Because one of the things that's very exciting about this health advice, sometimes it can sound a bit boring. People say, what's the best thing I can do to improve my aging, Andrew? And I say, well, you could quit smoking. And people go, well, I've heard that before. This isn't new advice, right? Or, exactly. Maybe you could do some exercise. No one's ever told me that before. But what's really cool about this health advice is that doing these things literally slows down the aging process. It changes our biology in a whole variety of ways. So if you think about exercise, it's really obvious. If you're running on the treadmill, if you're pedaling on a bike, whatever it is you're doing, you can feel your lungs going. If you're lifting some weights, you can feel your muscles. You can really feel that those parts of your body are being impacted. But we also know that exercise reduces your risk of heart disease, it reduces your risk of some kinds of cancer, it reduces your risk of dementia even. Yeah. So it's got this broad effect on the whole of your biology. And so what that means is, perhaps for people who can't get access to all of these healthy lifestyle interventions, if we just had some anti-aging medicines in our back pocket, we could use that to supplement the public health advice. So I think public health is super important, but I would love to have both the public health and the investment in the biology that can develop these medicines to make it all a little bit easier for everyone with their busy lives to try and age a little bit more slowly and hopefully stay healthier longer.
Dr. Andrew, you mentioned about age-related ill, for example, like cancer, dementia, cardiovascular ill. What kind of, or how it can be improved in terms of infrastructure, support system? How do you look in terms of, especially in the context of Malaysia, what kind of improvement that need to be done to tackle age-related ill? Yeah.
I think the most important thing, and this isn't just for Malaysia, but every country around the world, is to have a much bigger focus on preventative medicine. And that's to stop people getting ill in the first place. Because the fact is, a statistic that's sort of really shocking actually, is that even if we were to completely cure cancer, literally eradicate cancer as a disease, that would only add 2 or 3 years to life expectancy. And the reason for that is that most people who get cancer tend to be older people. And because they're older, they've got a load of other diseases that are often happening at the same time. They might have a bit of heart disease, they might have some early stages of cognitive decline, so sort of the early stages of dementia. They might have some diabetes going on or something like that. And that means that only 2 or 3 years later, one of those other diseases that they already have becomes severe enough to take their life. And so the single most important thing is to intervene early, is to stop people getting ill. And that's why I'm so excited about this idea of developing medicines that can slow down aging and stop people getting to this late stage. And I think the reason that this is particularly important for a country like Malaysia, when I try and take a global perspective on this, people say, oh, isn't this just for the rich world? Or sometimes people say, isn't this for billionaires who want to live forever, frankly? You hear about anti-aging medicine, that's often the first thing that springs to mind. But actually, Malaysia is a really great example. It's a almost exactly average upper middle income country. So if we split the world into different income brackets, there's the high income countries, the US, most of the countries in Europe, there's the low income countries, and in the middle there's this huge block of middle income. And then the upper middle income is about 2.8 billion people live in countries that are quite similar to Malaysia in lots of ways. And if we think about Malaysia from an economic point of view, the GDP per capita here is about $11,000 per person. So that's the rough size of the economy. Compare that to the US, it's about $75,000 per person, so obviously a lot more money. The average for the European Union is about $40,000 per person, so again, quite a lot more cash. And that means that we can afford to have much bigger, more extensive healthcare systems. If Malaysia wanted to have a sort of quote-unquote Western-style healthcare system, it would cost most or even all of its GDP per capita, which obviously wouldn't be sustainable. And so I think that these anti-aging medicines are going to have the biggest impact in these middle-income countries. And the reason is, we've just talked about GDP, let's now talk about life expectancy. The life expectancy here in Malaysia is 76 years old. And if you compare that to the US at the moment is somewhere around 78. So you guys, you've basically caught up with us in the Western world in terms of life expectancy, but the GDP has still got a bit of a way to go. And so if you want to try and save your healthcare systems money and save your pension systems money, we just need to keep people healthier for longer, right? And that, I think, is the single most important message. So this isn't just a thing for the rich world. This is definitely a thing for all of the middle-income countries, the low-income countries. If we can develop cheap anti-aging medicines and make sure they're accessible globally, I think that's the single biggest impact that this science can have.
One of the major factors, to live a happy life and a healthy life is to take care of your mental health. This is super important. And in Malaysia especially, we've seen a lot of companies, the private sector is taking a lead and also actions to ensure about mental health and also their healthcare of their workers and all that. Not just to provide the services of insurance, for instance, in that sense, but to ensure that they live a healthy lifestyle. But how do you see that the private sector can play a greater role in this whole area and initiatives as well?
I think the private sector is just really, really important. And again, from my point of view, I look at a lot of this in terms of the biology, the medicine, and in that respect, the companies that provide that medical care are hugely, hugely important. The companies that develop and roll out the drugs. Because I think the first thing we need to do is invest in the basic science of the medicine. And what that means is that's probably going to be things like government and philanthropic funding, so charitable funding of research. And the reason is that basic research, when you're just sort of trying stuff out to see what happens, it's very, very high risk. No investor is going to say, oh, I'm going to throw a load of money at something, but it's only got a 1% chance of success. People want to see their return in 5 years. So once the government has funded this very, very high risk stuff and we find a few things that work, that's when the private sector is able to take over. And something the private sector is really, really good at is taking some little molecule that someone's developed in a lab and turning it into a mass production ecosystem where they can then roll that out to everybody in the healthcare system. And I think the coronavirus vaccines are actually a really good example of this. It was an idea that had been developed in academic labs, but then the pharmaceutical companies were the ones that were able to scale up that production and start producing millions, billions of doses of these things. And that's what we're going to need in order to make sure that this medicine gets accessible to everybody. We're going to have to learn how to produce it and distribute it at low cost. And I think that's the single most important thing the private sector is going to do here.
This investment you're talking about requires a lot of the huge investments in terms of dollar and cents. And in Malaysia, we face this situation. We do have to a certain extent, but we have this situation what we call our R&D, research and development. At the end of the day, ended as a book. And on the shelves. So in terms of commercialization and then to go into the market and all that, it faces a lot of challenges in terms of funds and all that. But how do you see that this kind of challenges should be eradicated in terms of getting all this R&D into commercialization and then getting into the market and people can consume this kind of solutions that we have? Because we have a lot of R&D from our universities, for instance. But in terms of putting money in and trust the system and trust that this is the future. Yeah.
I think actually the single most important thing is more money. And maybe that sounds like I'm a scientist asking for more money. That I promise is not what's going on. Yeah. The reason is, if I look at around the world, the amounts of money that are invested in research, the way I try and think about it is in dollars per person per year, compared to the size of the challenge that research is trying to address. And I often use the US as an example. The reason is, firstly, it's one of the biggest research economies in the world. And secondly, I think it just shows you, even in the leading research economy in the world, how comparatively little we spend on science. So cancer research, that's obviously very important. It kills about 1/3 of people in the US, pretty similar numbers in Malaysia. Even in the US, which is the biggest spender on government-funded cancer research in the world, the amount is $20 per person per year. And that's for a disease that kills 1/3 of people. You could easily spend that on a small meal out in the United States. And yet, that is your entire annual contribution as the average US taxpayer to funding of this disease. And then let's talk about aging. Now, aging in the US causes about 85% of deaths. Because if you add up the cancer, the heart disease, the dementia, the increased risk from infections as you get older, and so on, by far the majority of US deaths are caused by that. And the US is unusual because it's one of the few countries in the world that has a National Institute for Aging, so a devoted government body for funding research into aging biology. That's exciting until you look at the numbers, because they invest about $1 per person per year in the basic biology of aging. That is wild, right? This is something that causes 85% of US deaths, but they're spending $1 per person. I'd throw $10 at it, even if the scientists were going to almost waste it all. Like, I'm willing to roll the dice for that amount of money for my life, for the life of my friends, my family, for everyone around the world. And what I found, trying to investigate this for other countries, is very, very difficult. So I tried to do this in my home country of the UK, and I would be sending emails and calling up government departments and saying, how much do you spend on aging research? And they'd just say, well, we don't know. And the reason is that historically, aging biology has been a very small part of biology, a very small field. Cancer research gets by far the most research funding. Still not enough, as I hope I've just illustrated, but by far the most within science. And then when you talk about aging, it's often been thought of as a bit of a niche field. Perhaps it's a field that's, it's a bit of snake oil. There's been this sort of reputation it's had in the past. And so it just gets a lot less funding. And governments often don't recognize it as a separate area of research. And so I think one of the best things that we could see is if all around the world people could copy that US model and create a National Institute for Aging and create research institutes and university departments that are specifically focused on this biology. And then hopefully, maybe we could aspire to invest more than $1 per person in those institutes as well. So I think it sometimes seems like we've got a lot of R&D, but actually when you look at the numbers, it's not as much. And this is sort of the fundamental contradiction. I wrote this book, and there is more than a book's worth of cool science happening on aging. My first draft was too long, and my editors had to remove some of the words that I'd written. So there's so much exciting stuff that I could talk to you for hours and hours about all the cool stuff that's happening in labs. And yet at the same time, we're investing far too little. And communicating that seeming paradox, I think, is my biggest challenge.
Dr. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us. I think we should have more conversation and
to understand how to strike a balance. This is a challenge, because we are talking about fiscal policy, and we are talking about other policies as well. It should come hand in hand together, right? And the whole of government and all the people as well, and the community of scientists and the universities and also the academicians come together to to create this institute and focus on these science of aging in parallel with other sciences as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Steele, the author of Ageless, the new science of getting older without getting old.
This book.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. Sekian sahaja Niaga Awani siaran khas yang kami bawakan bersempena dengan ISWC 2024, dan kita akan bersiaran semula esok.
Esok lagi.
Pukul 12 kejap lagi kita ada crossover daripada sini juga. Sekian sahaja Niaga Awani untuk waktu ini. Saya Haris Ashraf Hasnan.
Saya Najib Arif. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.